Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout. First, before we get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Britt Hall. I'm a professor here, associate professor of biology here at the U of R. And before I introduce our speakers or say anything myself, I just want to give a shout out to the graduate students that did the vast majority of work organizing this. I decided to put together this rally on Thursday and knew that I couldn't possibly do a very good job if I didn't have an engine. And for those of you that work at the university, you will understand that graduate students are that engine. They're the engine of our research, and they're the engine of this event today. So Heather and Cameron are serving burgers, and Derek Smith, and all of the Bugs crew. Thank you for those of you that were able to lend a little bit of a hand. So is the audio okay? I was hoping to get a number on how many scientists and citizens were protesting in Ottawa today, but I wasn't able to get that. So for those of you that don't know, we planned this event to coincide with an event in Ottawa. There's a conference of the Society of Ecology and Evolution happening in Ottawa this week, and they have actually set aside a whole session to allow for a protest and a march to Parliament Hill. So tune into the national news today. It will definitely be part of that. They actually did a funeral with a procession and a Grim Reaper, and we would have loved to do something like that, but again, only a few short days didn't really allow that. So the reason we're having this event is that we as scientists really feel that science in Canada is under attack. And it has been apparent over the last couple months that Stephen Harper's government really has a disdain for environmental, or not only environmental, but all types of evidence-based research. It all started with the long-form mandatory census, which was cancelled, and I believe Mark's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But that really started to get people talking in the hallways and in their laboratories. But it wasn't really until the federal budget came down in March that people and scientists started to get mad. There are a long list of examples of how the federal government has perpetrated this attack on science. I don't really know where to begin. First off, there was the cancellation of the National Roundtable on the Ecology and Environment. This was a science think tank, a research think tank, that was to provide evidence to the government about how the economy and the environment are intimately linked. They tabled a report a few months ago that was critical of the oil sands, and as a result, their funding was pulled and the roundtable was disbanded. This is something that John Baird, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, has actually admitted. They didn't like the evidence, so they pulled the funding. There's been numerous cuts to science programs at Environment Canada, Agriculture Canada, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. If anyone wants to talk about those in detail, please come and speak with me. Two notable examples of these cuts are the Pearl Station, which is the Polar Environment Atmospheric Research Station in Nunavut, and the Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario. Both of these programs were world-renowned research programs, research facilities that will be closed come the end of the fiscal year in March 2013. The Experimental Lakes area especially has galvanized a lot of people, and the organizers of the Ottawa rally are mostly ELA people. And then one more example I want to set before you is, of course, all of the program cuts to the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council funding. So if you are not a health-based scientist, so if you are a computer scientist or a mathematician or a chemist or an environmental scientist, you as a university researcher depend on NSERC to put chemicals in your lab, to buy computers for you to work on, and most importantly, you use this money to pay your graduate students a stipend. So this program has been cut over the last few years, and a lot of the resources that have gone towards this NSERC We have two speakers here today, it looks like, and I'll introduce the first one. Mark Spooner is associate professor in education, and he was also the NDP candidate in the last federal election in Wisconsin. And so he's going to give us a little bit of perspective from a social activism and especially from the long-term census side of things.
Well, one thing I got to tell you as a social scientist, when the scientists say they want to organize a rally, I tell you, you answer that call. So I don't think we can have a funeral without some music. Here we go. Well, you get the idea. If I had more time, I would have tried to get a piper to actually come in and do that. And never mind any of the speeches. But anyway, I want to say, first of all, thanks a lot to the organizers and to all of you who are here who value evidence-based policy and transparency. I'd also like to take just a brief moment to acknowledge the Treaty 4 lands that we're on that allow us all to be gathered here peacefully. So the Harper government is attacking science and evidence-based policy via two main avenues, by not funding research and by muzzling scientists. Examples of not funding research include major budget reductions to research programs at Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Library and Archives Canada, the National Research Council, and Statistics Canada. They include decisions to close major natural and social science research institutions such as the world-renowned Experimental Lakes Area, the National Council of Welfare, and the First Nations Statistical Institute. Closing of the Polar Environmental Atmospheric Research Lab, or PEARL, in Eureka, Nunavut, as was mentioned, and of course, cutting the mandatory long-form census. I'd like to take a moment to discuss the cutting of the mandatory long-term census. The decision to replace the mandatory long-form census with a voluntary abbreviated survey costs $30 million more than the mandatory form, and it has resulted in less reliable data and particularly targets the poor and marginalized, who tend to have more difficulty with the census. So as we know less and less about the poor and the marginalized, they become all the easier to ignore. Sam Boshra, a former analyst for StatsCan, puts it this way in a Rabble article: if this results in the poor and unemployed being undercounted, the government could justify reallocating resources away from programs targeting these disadvantaged groups. But that is not the only reason to mourn the loss of the mandatory census. A July 2010 Globe and Mail article reads, census data, rather than being the preserve of statisticians and policy wonks, is embedded in daily life. It drives everything from corporate fundraising drives in Toronto to the deployment of BC lunch programs for school kids, and from the layout of suburban subdivisions to the prescriptions of think tanks of every ideological bent. Although I should note that the Fraser Institute actually supported the cut to the long-form census, so you should keep that in mind. Thanks for that. The implications are even wider, says prominent demographer David Foote. He notes the structure of the census surveys form the basis of much of StatsCan's other analyses, including vital labor force measures such as the unemployment rate. His criticism of the government's plan is pointed. I find it a little disturbing that the industry minister doesn't seem to understand that knowledge is essential in a knowledge economy. Now on to the muzzling of scientists. A few high-profile examples of the new Harper policy in action. Last fall, Environment Canada barred David Tarazic from speaking to journalists about his ozone layer research when it was published in Nature. And the Privy Council office stopped Christina Miller, a researcher at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, from doing interviews about a study she published in Science on the causes of sockeye salmon decline in BC. Even general government workers are being told to zip it. More recently, as noted by the CBC, Parks Canada employees have received letters warning they're not allowed to criticize the agency or the federal government. Workers are not supposed to speak about the cuts, whether at meetings, forums, or through social media. Only designated people are allowed to deal with journalists. In fact, censorship has gotten so bad in Canada that even one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, Nature, has felt the obligation to speak out, not once, but twice. Once in 2010, and most recently in March of this year. And in their commentary entitled Frozen Out, they state, since Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative Party won power in 2006, there has been a gradual tightening of media protocols for federal scientists and other government workers. Researchers who once would have felt comfortable responding freely and promptly to journalists are now required to direct inquiries to Media Relations Office, which demands written questions in advance and might not permit scientists to speak. Canadian journalists have documented several instances in which prominent researchers have been prevented from discussing published, peer-reviewed literature. Policy directives and emails obtained from the government through Freedom of Information reveal a confused and Byzantine approach to the press, prioritizing message control and showing little understanding of the importance of the free flow of scientific knowledge. Frozen out is right. Here's one example that describes just how cautious and fearful government workers have become, as reported by the Ottawa Citizen in April 2012. The Ottawa Citizen asked the National Research Council a simple question in March. What is the joint study that you and NASA are doing on falling snow? Nothing top secret here. They're talking about falling snow. Before sending even a modest response, however, it took a small army of staffers, 11 of them by the Citizen's count, to decide how to answer, and dozens of emails back and forth to circulate the Citizen's request, discussing its motives, developing the response, and massaging its text. All this for a few questions about how snow falls. NASA, meanwhile, answered everything in a single phone call. It took about 15 minutes. That just goes to show you that we've had a real shift between the Bush and Obama administrations and now the Harper administration here, which has actually gotten much worse than the Bush administration was in the United States. Now papers released under an access to information request show the Byzantine world of how federal departments respond to even the simplest request for information with second-guessing, internal strategy, but few answers. I've been thinking about this, so they've had a lot of trouble fielding calls on snow. I was wondering what happened to the staffers at Environment Canada when they had to field the calls about those awe-inspiring mammary or bubble clouds. and the emails that must have went back and forth about that. But to conclude, findings, research, knowledge are to be critiqued and contested, yes, but they are to be heard, to be acted upon, to be part of the public discourse and the democratic process, as it has been Canada's rich tradition for decades before this anti-democratic, anti-scientific, and anti-higher learning Harper government. We must mourn and resist the death of evidence and evidence-based policy. Thank you.